Good evening. Welcome to Reflections on Granby. My name is Mike Malloy, and I'll be your host this evening. This is the second show we're taping on April 28th, 2012. Our guest tonight, our second guest tonight, the wife of our previous guest, Roger Hernsdorf, is Diane Newman Hernsdorf, a 74-year-old resident of Barndore Hills Road in Granby and a 51-year resident of the town. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Diane. Okay, so once you just watched your husband tape, so you have the luxury of a little bit of experience here. Where were you born?
I was born in Bangor, Maine.
In what year?
1937.
Okay.
In October as well.
Okay.
I'm just a little bit younger than Raj.
Yep.
And my family moved to Connecticut when I was about 2.
Okay.
So I lived a few years in Hartford.
Okay.
And then following that, I spent most of my childhood in schooling in Wethersfield, Connecticut.
Oh, great. Okay, getting back to Bangor just a little bit. What are your earliest memories of Bangor? It's a late Depression?
Absolutely
early war?
have none.
Really?
None except pictures that I...
So how old were you when you moved?
Well, I was 2.
Oh,
So
okay, yeah.
I was a little bit young and... I don't know, to have that kind
you're
of
not going to have
memory.
any memories. Yeah,
The only memories I have would be photographs of my dad, who was driving a moving truck,
Okay.
Doing whatever he could.
So your dad worked as a mover at that point?
He was a driver and did whatever. They had come from potato farming up in northern Maine.
Okay.
And so they're resourceful and figured they could do whatever job they could get.
What was your maiden name?
Gould.
Gould, okay.
G-O-U-L-D.
So Diane Gould came from Bangor, Maine, and came back down to Wethersfield?
Came to Hartford.
Hartford, okay, originally,
Right.
okay. So you moved to Hartford, and do you have any memories of Hartford?
I do have memories of Hartford. I lived on 100 Park Terrace,
Okay.
which is not too far from Burns School, which was the latest and greatest school built in Hartford at that time.
So you had the luxury of a brand new school.
I went to kindergarten in the most elegant Hartford school there was at the time.
That's great.
I had to walk the long way around the block, but I lived on the second floor of a classic 2-family per floor, 6.
So that's in the west side of...
It was not too far from Capitol Avenue.
Okay, yeah, okay.
So it was down there, Park Street.
Okay.
I could walk to Park Street.
Yep.
Polk Park was where I swung on the swings.
Yep.
And we had no houses across the street from us. And in the last couple of years, those 2 houses in that area have been torn down.
Okay.
But for a long time.
So what do you remember then? What was the demographic there? Was it mostly a Maine...
It was a mixture of families. It was a Polish family lived downstairs.
Yep.
And old-time gal who was an Eastern Star friend of my mom's lived on the same level with us on our floor.
Yeah.
And then there were an Irish family across the way because there was another 6-family place in the other building.
Okay.
That we were not too far from windows,
It's
not
a very
quite as
mixed
close.
neighborhood.
It was a wonderful mixed neighborhood,
Yeah.
and it really was at the time when Park Street was kind of a melting pot.
Mm-hmm.
They had very strong Catholic churches that had a lot of French, a lot of Polish, and a little bit of ethnic grocery stores, and 5 and 10s and fabric shops and shoe stores. And
now, melting pot in the regard that the people lived there were from different ethnicities, but were they direct immigrants, some of them? I mean,
some of them
yeah,
were.
yeah.
Some were where the grandmothers didn't always speak the same language that everybody else did.
Okay. Did you have... so you would interact with quite a diverse group at school.
Right,
I mean,
right.
that was... okay, so what was the school system like in Hartford in that day? Were you...
Well, it certainly was more than adequate and up to speed. The kindergarten, it was a total brick building, and it wasn't 2 floors. I think maybe 2 floors on part of it. It was one of the first elementary schools in Hartford to have a gym.
Okay.
It had a place where you could look. Well, they had brick walls on the inside. They had beautiful showcases that were lit in the walls that provided light in the hallways.
Okay.
And
so would you fill those with like your
old people's artwork, or
I
decorations
can
and displays,
that
kind of stuff.
School, yeah.
But the kindergarten, well, they were maybe not quite the size of that table.
Okay.
But they were probably 3 by 6 or whatever would work for sliding glass panels, but they always had something interesting in them.
Okay.
But the kindergarten room was an exquisite place in that you walked in and it was one level where you had reading tables and puzzles and activities.
Right.
And then down a step, and it was a play area where they had an indoor playroom.
Okay.
And then we had a window seat and all sorts of musical instruments. So we used to have music there. We had our own walled playground. So that the kindergartners had their own space to play.
So they could play safely.
They could play safely and wouldn't have wander off into the street or into. But I don't even remember the size of the other playgrounds.
You have quite a vivid memory of your kindergarten.
I love that room. It was truly beautiful.
Yeah.
My mom also had, reminded me of various things that I did, but it was the fact that it was more than one level within the room.
Right.
Was very unique.
That's a cool setup. Yeah, it's like an amphitheater or something.
It was and I've gone by that school for years because it's still there. They're doing a big deal on doing some renovating of it.
Oh, good.
But a gal that has in recent years worked with me also went to Burns School.
Oh, wow.
And so we had traded stories about what it was like. She's about 2 years behind me.
Oh, okay.
And at that time, she was saying, too, that there were youngsters that came at the end of the Second World War with their families and immigrated. Latvia, Russians, and more Polish and some the French. And these were youngsters that were just total immersion. They didn't get any special language skills. They jumped right in and learned the language right along with the rest of us.
They got dumped right into class.
Right into class, and they swam very well.
Yeah, interesting. So you that era was a little different in the way things were.
A little different than what they run now.
Yeah,
but that school was built well enough in such a good design that it is still standing.
Now let me ask you a question. What your father was he still doing driving?
He was doing some odds and ends of things, and then ultimately got a job working over at Pratt & Whitney.
Okay.
And
so this is during the war.
Right.
Yeah.
He had not finished high school where he was. Mm-hmm. He had stopped to work on the farm. And when he got to Hartford, friends of theirs encouraged him, and he went off and did night school, and he studied electricity. And ultimately, when he got a real full-time good job over at Pratt & Whitney, he was an electrician.
Oh, great. So he was constantly bettering himself.
Yeah. Right.
Did your mom work?
Not then.
Okay.
No, she was busy doing a lot of stuff at church with doing bandages and writing cards to people in the service and doing things that moms did at that time.
World War II was full mobilization. Everybody did something.
Everybody did
kids
something.
Collected cans.
Yep.
It was.
And you flattened you saved the newspapers. You flattened the cans, and you used everything you could over. And you had, I remember, rationing. And the rationing books.
Right.
And certain times you couldn't buy butter. Sometimes if you saved up your coupons, you could buy meat.
That was
and margarine, the kind that you had to mush your own on.
My mother used to talk about that.
My father hated it so bad.
They had a name for it. Was it Oleo or something?
Oleo margarine.
Yeah, Oleo margarine.
With a little colored capsule
so it looked
in the
like
middle.
butter.
Oh.
So that's fascinating. So you grew up, but you were young. That's all you knew. That wasn't
right. And by the time I got to the end of first grade, we had moved to Wethersfield.
Okay.
But they had typewriters in the second grade, and I was looking forward to being able to get, to learn that. Yeah, I mean, it was a school that was way ahead of its time.
Okay.
None of that existed at Wethersfield when I got out there.
Really?
It was a neat place, but it didn't have those
Hartford
kind of
had state-of-the-art school, or
well,
some.
They had a couple.
One,
They had a couple. I don't say that they were everywhere, but that was a model school that was built.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
So you went from there to Wethersfield, and how second grade you said?
Second grade.
Okay. So you're in Wethersfield. What were your experiences? What are your memories of Wethersfield in that time?
Well,
you're still in the war.
It was during the war. It was in housing that was built. I was living in a duplex. We had 4 rooms. Okay. I was an only child, so that's what it was. And because my dad was working in the defense industry, we were able to get a rent in this particular set of housing that was built between Wolcott Road and Silverstein Highway, sort of on the southwest corner of Wethersfield.
It's a pretty developed part of town.
And it was. I mean, yes, Wethersfield is a pretty built, even then.
Yeah.
This was built as, like you might call it, subsidized housing today.
Okay. So there was quite an influx of people moving into the area to work at Pratt and some of the defense industry at the time. So they were really kind of...
But it was a neighborhood that was mixed, and it had people who were coming back from having served in the service.
Okay.
And there were lawyers, young lawyers starting out. There were some doctors' families. We had the people that had started and were running the Flower Box Florist Shop lived in that same area. We had a circle of houses with a center core with a court. And we used to have block parties in the center court.
I think I've turned around in some of those streets down there. There's like 3 or 4 streets that are set up just like that, huh?
Yeah. Boardman Terrace and can't remember the other one now, but it was Beverly Road went up and Treat Road, and it was a great place to grow up.
Right.
We've been back and had reunions a couple of years ago.
Oh, that's great.
We went back and visited the senior center and then took a walk all around. And the folks that are there now were looking out the door. Like one of them said, are you people planning to buy the places?
Oh, really?
And we said, no. We used to all live here, and we were just trying to see what it was like. And it looked very much the same, except we all had more flower gardens and we had planted trees, and it had a little bit more individuality.
So is this public housing now?
I think it still is public housing.
So they just upgraded the houses over the years? Interesting. Well, so you went from there to where?
From Wethersfield?
Yeah.
When I graduated high school.
So you went. Okay, so you stayed in Wethersfield
Wethersfield up until then.
And you lived at the same house.
Yep.
And you graduated from Wethersfield, and by now we're in the 50s.
Right.
Yeah.
In the middle of the 50s.
What was it like? I mean, that's a fascinating. You think of Happy Days, and those are.
It really was.
Was it?
We had a good spirit. We had a group of us that used to work on projects together. I used to work on the shows. I was a scenery painter and backstage kind of person for musicals that we did. We did the 17 in high school.
Okay, in the school. Okay, right.
But I mean, there were I won't say neighborhood active. The PTO was active as far as parents were concerned. We had scouting programs, baseball. The guys I knew all played up through and went on to Legion Ball. And
so it's good. So it's like a small town kind of.
It was a small town feel at the time. It was a pretty good population.
Yeah.
Because starting at the Hartford border, and then our end of it was running into farmers' fields. It wasn't as developed beyond the end of Wolcott Hill Road, where it then ran into Prospect Street.
Now, I asked your husband some questions along this vein, but this is a slightly bigger question. Is that in that era, it seemed like everybody was still young that had come back from the war. Mm-hmm. You didn't seem to have the early 50s, mid 50s, even into the late 50s. You didn't seem to have the divisiveness that happened after that. It seemed like everybody was kind of on the same page on most things in the neighborhood. You know, it seemed like the towns were very homogenized in many ways. I read stuff about Enfield that it was an all-American city in 1970. You know, and you look at that, and what was the difference in the neighborhoods that you see? I mean, you're in Granby now, so it's probably very similar to that then.
It feels a little bit like that.
Yeah.
The neighborhoods were like we were not treated any different for being public housing.
Right.
We went, you could maybe feel a little bit self-conscious, but nobody said, oh, you live in public housing or you live over on the far end of town.
Right.
The center of town where the old houses were had a little bit more prestige. Those
old
people
Wethersfield?
had Wethersfield, because it's gorgeous down there. And they had the big field in the middle, the world's biggest green.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
It's just beautiful. And we could walk down there. I used to walk down there to dancing school, and then I got to walk. I did a lot of walking.
But I think even today, in high school, the kids interact fairly. I mean,
they do.
Regardless of how much money their parents have.
We didn't have a great ethnic collection of people.
Okay.
So we were kind of homogeneous, and that we were people who some people had come back to Wethersfield from maybe serving in the war, or like we had come down from Maine, and families like that. There were some others that were in transition that was starter homes for them, and then they moved on to some other more sophisticated
housing. So it truly
housing.
was Happy Days for you.
It really
was. Good times, yeah.
You know, you could ride your bicycle, you could skate down the sidewalk, and occasionally people would yell at you for don't cross the corner on my lawn, but that's as tough as it got.
That never changes.
and we all knew the policemen who were somebody's big brother.
Right.
Down the street was one of the young cops, so it was, you knew who the people were that were around. And the superintendent of schools was one of these people that believed in paying visits to all the schools. He would show up at the elementary school and just go around and visit all the classes and just come in and sit down and just, ask people questions.
He wanted to know what was going on. He
wants to know what's going on. He was a real good-natured kind of guy.
It's a good way to do it.
It was kind of neat.
Yeah. Okay, so you're in Wethersfield. You graduate high school. What do you do?
Then I went off to Hartford College.
Hartford College?
Yeah. Okay. I was on the bus going to school for 2 years.
Now that became University of Hartford.
University of Hartford, yes.
Yes, okay.
Took it over, and now they're trying to sell the property. But when I first started going to Hartford College, it was on Highland Street where there were all nursing homes.
Okay.
And it was one big house, and there were 18 of us in one class and 22 in the other.
That was the college?
That was the college. It was the first women's 2-year school in Hartford. We were like a branch of Mount Holyoke.
Okay,
It was started by some Holyoke alumni who wanted to offer an opportunity that was reasonably priced for young women to go to school.
Similar to their
And a friend of my mom's daughter was there and decided that that would be a good place for me. So I was living at home. My parents were building a house in Bloomfield.
Right.
Because my mom was then working for Connecticut General, and my father was still working with the Ham Standard division of Pratt & Whitney, and it was planning to move to Windsor Locks.
So they were both making better money.
So they were going to go to Bloomfield because they always wanted a house of their own.
Okay.
So while I was doing that, they were building a house, literally hand to hand. And at the end of my first 2 years, they had finished the house, so I was out there for the summer.
Okay.
And then I went off to Earlham College in Indiana.
Earlham, okay.
Mm-hmm.
So you're 2 years at Hartford College. What did you, was it just liberal arts? Was it?
Liberal arts,
okay.
Pure liberal arts.
So it was just a prep kind of college?
Yeah, we had our professors were from Smith, Holyoke, Wesleyan, and Trinity. And
so you had some pretty good staff.
They had wonderful staff, and Miss Johnson was our dean and ultimate president of it. She was building it. Bought the Severance Estate the year that I graduated from Hartford College in '57.
I didn't make the connection. Hartford College for Women.
Hartford College for Women.
That's what I hear more. Yeah, okay.
That's what it is.
Yeah, okay.
And
so you went from there to get it. What degree did you pursue? And
went off and was working on biology.
Okay.
Biology and art.
Okay.
And so I had
a
double. Well, it worked. You have to draw lots of pictures when you're doing those observations and slide reviews. So
did you always have an interest in science? Is that,
yep.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so you graduated from there. That was another 2 years?
That was 2 more years.
Okay.
That was '59.
Okay.
And in the interim, I had met Otto at a day down in Wesleyan.
So he was going to Wesleyan?
He was going to Wesleyan.
Yep.
And finishing up. He finished up a year ahead of me.
Okay.
And then he went off to Maxwell School to study public administration.
Okay.
And I was in Indiana.
Okay.
And when he got through and I got through, then in '59 we got married.
Okay, great. So you get married. Where do you move?
We moved to a place where there's a job, which was called Albany, New York.
Okay, yeah.
And he worked on the staff for Governor Rockefeller for a year and a half.
Oh, wow. So
that
got
was
right
very
into politics.
interesting.
Yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
right. Well, that
was his degree.
They were chief. Well, it wasn't really politics, but it was on how to make it work.
Okay.
So
the actual government administration.
Right.
So he got a degree in that, and he went to work for Rockefeller, who was governor of the state of New York. Okay.
So we
he
were
was
in
governor
Albany.
quite a while, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we were only there for a couple of years.
Okay. So what did he do?
And then we moved to Granby when Granby passed a charter and had need of a chief administrative officer.
Town manager.
Which became the town manager, but we called it a CAO.
Did they really?
Oh, yes. For a long time, it was not a town manager. It was a CAO.
Yeah.
And applied for the job and got it.
Okay.
So then we came back to Connecticut because he was from Hartford anyway.
So he's in his mid-20s at this point. He's not that,
like 23, 24.
Okay. And he got a job as well, the experience working for a governor's staff probably helped him.
Well, that helped, plus the fact that you when you're trained with the Maxwell School, they teach you on budgeting and program management and all the facets of what make up a good operation for a political entity, which is a town.
Right. Interesting. So you and then say from there, from that point forward, you lived in Granby.
We've lived in Granby.
Okay, so Otto must have come on a job interview. Okay, so
Yep.
he sees an opening.
Right.
So he gets on the bus and goes to Granby and comes home. What did he tell you when he came home?
Well, he said it was time to leave New York.
Right.
And he said,
did he know he had the
is it.
job at that point? They didn't hire him right on the spot.
Yeah, well, it did take long.
Right.
I don't know how many people he interviewed, to tell you the truth.
What was his description of Granby before? Do you remember? I mean, this is going back just a town.
It was a small town that looked like it would be something that he would enjoy working with because it was a blank slate.
Right.
And that you had your structures, you had your Board of Finance, you had a Board of Selectmen, and you had a town meeting, and he understood those concepts. And he had also worked sort of as an intern and had worked with Carlton Sharp, who was then the true town manager in Hartford back in the old days when they had corporation councils.
Okay.
And he was fascinated by that whole thing. That's why he went to Maxwell School. Okay. So he felt that he could begin to apply some of the things that he learned.
Right. So you came, he got the job, and you moved here. Where did you move in Granby?
We moved to Harmony Hill, part of Granby, because it was a good starter home.
Right.
We could afford it.
Okay.
And that was just off Wells Road, which is kind of ironical because a few years later, Raj shows up down there. But we knew one another in 4-H type of activities. But we were on Harmony Hill until 1967 and 8. We were building a house on Haven Drive.
Okay.
So we moved from there because by that time I had 4 children.
Okay, you want to share their names? You're a very quick study, by the way. You just bang, 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 bang. So 4 kids. What were their names?
Well, we had an Otto, who's known as Chip.
Yeah.
And then I have Jennifer.
Okay.
And then I have a Kurt.
Yep.
And then we have a Mark.
Okay. And they came fairly quick succession?
Well, every 2 years.
Every 2 years. Yeah. Of course, it had to be scheduled. I'm noting your personality. No, okay. So Otto's basically running the town at that point in terms of the management side of it.
He was.
And what were the experiences of? I'll have you speak for him a little bit. What were your experiences for both of you guys, or impressions of doing a startup, basically? The startup corporation.
A true startup thing.
A municipal corporation.
I have a lot of nostalgia associated with what they call the town hall, kindergarten town hall, or town hall kindergarten.
Okay.
It's a building that now has been given to South Congregational Church again, but it's on the campus there behind what was the library that is now the V&A building. There's a school-shaped building back there.
I don't think I've actually made it that deep in the complex, but I take your word for it.
If you pull into where the V&A building is and go to look straight ahead, there's an old white, like a 2-room school.
Okay.
In that building, when we came to town, was the office for the assessor, the town clerk, the jail was downstairs.
Right.
And Don Algren was chief. Yes.
So you never knew who was going to be in the cellar in the morning.
No cells.
So they didn't keep him there too long.
They really didn't. He had arrangements that they did with someplace else. And upstairs in the part where they had a meeting room in the back section of it, they built a room about 2/3 the size of this room for a couple of file cabinets and a desk for Otto.
Wow.
And that was going to be his office.
That's quite exclusive.
It was, but what was his practice was to be there for a short period of time each day.
Yeah.
And then he was out on the road.
Right.
Because he wanted to know what the crew was doing. He wanted to meet the people in the town.
And he was green. He had to get his hands on everything.
He had to learn what Granby was, what made it tick, who the players were, and who the people were that he was going to be working with.
Yeah, he had to immerse himself.
Because you had three selectmen. One of them was George Tuffin, and one was, I think, Chris Riley, who was a dear friend of ours for years, and might have even been Bob Knuckles.
Okay. We interviewed him.
And then there was one more, I don't think Dickie Sweeten was then at one point, but that's a kind of basic, starting crew you had.
Right. So there was three selectmen at the time.
There've been 5 selectmen.
Okay.
The first selectman, which was George, and then 4 others.
Okay, got it. Okay.
So, but anyway, you get to know, you have to get to know the town.
Yeah.
And you have to know the businesses in town and how that works together. And so that's what he did. He spent a lot of time out getting to know people.
It's been a fascinating position for a young guy.
It was fascinating. He loved it, and he was interested in all that they had to say.
Right.
He got to know Tudor Holcomb real well, and Don Algren and his operation, which was being our police chief.
Okay.
And part of the time that Don Algren was working, the telephone used to ring at Don's house. If he wasn't at the police station, they had an extension in his kitchen.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, it was basic Granby.
Yeah. Well, basic small town, really.
And it was, and it was just a transition, and the transition from being the selectman, because it was Bill Messenger Sr.
Right.
who had been for selectman.
Okay.
And the transition for the town from that, because he used to run it from his house, to a place in town hall with the rest of the staff that they had, was something that people had to live into.
Right.
So it was important that they feel connected. Was there much of a
learning curve there? It sounds like he was suited for the job, but it sounds like
he was fascinated. And then I used to get lots of phone calls too.
I bet. You're never going to believe. No. Anyway, you guys came from some relatively different, environments to come into a small town like Granby. So it must have been kind of fascinating. So where was he from originally?
He was from Hartford.
Okay, so he grew up in Hartford.
So he grew up in Hartford. He was a paper boy and went to Bulkley.
So you guys both were Hartford folks in some
sort of for a short time, and he grew up there, and his whole life was there.
So now what were any vivid memories from that time? I mean, the most striking situations that came up?
Oh, well,
there's quite a few.
There are probably several. It was an understanding that as a whole family, we were involved in what was going on in town, because people would stop you in the grocery store.
I can imagine.
I really meant to talk to Otto about this, and when can I see him, or what about this? And I'd say, well, why don't you call the office? Well, if there wasn't, I don't think we had answering machines at that point.
Yeah.
And we certainly didn't have cell phones.
Did you ever find yourself shopping in other towns?
It was, I would have long conversations with people, come back and share them with Otto, or they would call me, and I can still remember one day, my kids were probably, it was in a spring, like March and April, like now, everybody's out getting the sand out of the front yard and getting their lawn cleaned up. And this woman came down the road in her car and screeched to a halt and came up to the door, and she said, "Where is he?" And I said, "I don't know. You might be down to town hall." And she was just livid. She said, "I have just spent 2 days sweeping sand out of my front lawn, and I have had enough." And then I made the mistake of saying, well, that the line, because I'd heard this before, from the center of the road into people's
10
yards.
feet to 20 feet,
The first 5 or 10 feet of that lawn are probably, well, are they going to clean it? Yeah. Are they going to sweep it up for me? She was just, her hands were all blistered.
You couldn't resist, could you?
Furious. Well, I tried not to be flip, because I understood she wanted it to look good.
Disappointed when you say, hey, what the...
But she was just so distraught that they were not sweeping soon enough. They weren't sweeping up this mess.
Yeah.
And of course, they can't get it in people's lawns, but there's always that little bit of edgy stuff. So. The fact that you're living in a neighborhood, you're accessible, and if people want to tell you something, they're going to tell you.
Right.
So I tried not to necessarily get upset. It was part of the job. I would say, I'll write it down, thank you, and I was always writing notes down.
By default, you were part of the staff.
I was unpaid part of the staff, and there we would go. But
so what, were you working at the time? Or
no,
you stayed
I was home with the kids.
Good. Okay, so getting back to you, you were a mom. You were part of the town staff from unpaid. But were you involved with any other? You must have been. Getting
yeah. Well, as the kids began to grow, you do a little bit of the PTA at the time.
Yeah.
I was helping out a little bit. I'd joined the church, so I was doing some Sunday school activities, and my friend across the street was very, very strong on the YWCA county.
Okay.
We had a county operation, and they used to run what was called a women's club.
Okay.
And it was a way for people to meet other women.
Right.
And then you would have some classes on different kinds of things and nice programs, and some of it was a little bit on government. It was a lot like the Newcomers Club is today.
Okay.
And that it would feature different aspects of Granby life. So it was
good initiation point for people coming into town.
Right, a way to expand your horizons. And they would have international programs. Some speakers would come from other parts that were tied into the network of Y.
Interesting.
The Y World. Before there was a Y building, but then they had built a youth center, which was being managed by this particular group.
Okay.
And they were trying to do programming and fundraising and things like that. So it was interesting.
So it was plenty of civic type
Plenty of civic things to do, and then as the kids got older, it was a Cub Scout thing and the Girl Scout thing. And
right. Oh, yeah. An 8-year-old, so I know exactly.
If you're home, there's always more things to do than...
And there's always...
Then there's time for...
So, okay, so you're raising your family. Your husband is managing the town, and so we'll try this question. I always like with your husband. I preface it by saying I'm not. What are the biggest changes that you've seen in Granby between the time you moved here and now? What's the biggest? Does anything? Do you find yourself reflecting on any?
The biggest change for the good is that we finally have some schools that are reflective of the kind of programs that they've been trying to do in Granby for a long time. I remember when I used to substitute teach at Wells Road, and there was a bucket in the corner because it was a leak from the gutter on the far end. And now that is a beautiful complex. It's a gorgeous building that does all sorts of great things. And Kelly Lane was a brand new, modest but neat kind of place with a courtyard and things, and that's been expanded the same way, so that they have programs that are wonderful. And then Kern School has evolved into a really fine primary school with a great kindergarten program and nice playground stuff. And I used to do nature trail before I went to work, and we were always trying to find ways to enhance things for kids.
Using what you had.
There's just an awful lot of good enrichment that goes on now. We have a music program that is really, really neat that the kids take advantage of, and we have open space, and I don't know.
I've heard that from several folks from Granby of that generation or that era, that it sounds like the school systems were in a sort of a crisis almost.
They were basic.
Yeah.
And that we had, if you envision a house that works for you that might be a colonial house that we would enjoy.
Right.
They were starter homes. They were cinder block, long barracks type schools.
Right, post-war.
That were better than the wooden ones, but they didn't have as much character as the old two-room schools.
Right.
But they had room for all the kids, and they had kindergarten spaces in it. But they weren't built with the kind of construction that made them easy to maintain.
Minimalist.
So they were minimal, absolutely minimal, and so we're always trying to figure a way to upgrade them. We were always upset about the flat roofs.
Right.
And like when Kelly Lane, we started working on it, and I was
They never
involved
stopped
with helping
leaking.
to study. I can remember, I don't know how many building committees on redoing roofs on those flat buildings because they were complicated, and as we added pieces to them, the roofs keep changing and they kept leaking. So so that's the part that was always one of the things that was a goal of, personal goal of mine.
Right, just to get the infrastructure where it needed to be.
Because we had parents. We had a Granby Association of Parents when we were trying to keep the accreditation for the high school, and to get the town to be willing to build a school.
Right.
Because it was a farming community that moved into being sort of suburban, and more people's kids were staying in school and more children were coming, so that you needed to have better spaces for them.
I think every town, west of like the river, really, or the Windsor Locks, west of Windsor, has gone through that. It's where you have that struggle between the old school, for lack of a better word.
Right.
There's a pun there, but from that group, and then the needs of the new and the reality of the new. I mean, that's the hardest to understand. The vision is, I think, the biggest part.
Right.
Once you get the, but now they came. It sounds like they went through that back in the 70s here, and they've pretty much 70s, early 80s.
We did the 70s. We put a couple of pieces on the high school, upgraded that with a nice new gym and a library, media center. Right. You have to have the right names, and a big classroom building. And then regulations come along and they start looking at things, and among other things, that particular wing had windows that were too small, and it had some other faults. So when we ultimately came back and redid the high school campus, I can't remember now, it's maybe 8 years, 10 years, 15 years ago, that building went away, and we've got new stuff.
It's a beautiful campus there.
It is a much nicer campus.
Yeah. So you must take a lot of pride in all that. I mean, it's.
I do. I feel very strongly that that's one of those things. I was first selectman for one term, and I lost over the part of the issue of supporting the expansion of Kern School.
Really?
Yep.
So that was that contentious. Now let me. Okay, so
I'm jumpy here.
No. It's a fascinating subject. I mean, I just don't want to miss anything because you're so. But you lost an election because you supported expand, and it's not unique. I mean, it's a very contentious issue. Anytime you want to expand schools, in expand spending on education in any way, it's very contentious. Now, was the fault line the same as you see everywhere between the costs versus the argument that I often hear is that it's a luxury. You don't really need to. Was that similar? What was the contention? Why don't you preface it?
The contention was on the current school was on, did we really have good numbers that were going to tell us what the population was going to be? The population projections come out of the combination of the State Health Department and the State Board of Education. They will okay the size building. You can't just go and build a building because you think you're going to have 200 extra kids in a couple of years.
It's got to fit their formula because they're paying for a big chunk of it.
Well, they're going to give you some reimbursement for it, and so they want to make sure that you are planning enough space and that you're thinking ahead, but that you're not overbuilding for your area. And part of it was, do we really know that we're making the right plans? Are we really doing it the right way? Do we know that the building committee has got the right numbers for how much it's going to cost?
So you were getting a lot of this challenge from the community?
Some other board members.
Okay, all right.
That reflective of certain elements in the community. And we didn't have a large group of parents that were out advocating necessarily. Some were. A few single issue people, but it was more of, the Board of Ed wants everything, and we can't give them everything, kind of thing. Right? How that story goes. It's nothing new.
I'm in East Granby, and it's you hear that every year at budget time, right?
Right. I mean, they want the Taj Mahal. They need this. They need that. We can't do all of that. We can't afford. Well, we can't. We've proven it.
Of course we can't, but But anyway. It's hilarious to me because I've heard the same
story. It just doesn't change.
So you were on the Board of Selectmen for one term.
I was a first selectman for one term.
Oh, you were first selectman. Wow.
But I was on the board.
You guys must have some interesting conversations.
We do. I was on the board as a regular selectman from about 1981.
Okay.
And then ultimately I ran for first at the end of the time in 1987.
Okay.
And I served one term.
And
I ran again, but that's when the Kearns was there. It kept growing and growing. And, and it was a combination of the people running. It just wasn't meant, so it was fine. It was an experience that was an enriching one. And as I said, when you're on the board, any of the boards, education, the Board of Education is a very, very intense learning kind of board. And the Board of Selectmen, if you're first selectman, you learn more because you have to be ready with all the information, and the town manager is very good at that. He does the research for you.
Yeah,
and
you're the point man in some ways.
Right, right. So you got to make sure that you're prepared on everything. So I used to have bags of things. I had building committee bags. I had selectman bags. And
60 hats.
Yeah, but it was an exciting challenge, and it was like a full-time job.
Right.
For me.
Yeah.
You know,
I bet. Oh yeah, and you can. I think any board or commission, if you're into it, you can make it a full-time job, even if you're not the head of it. There's enough information. I mean, especially if you're the chairman or the first selectman.
Because you've got to follow what's going on in some of the building committees. You don't have to go to them all, but you have to kind of listen to them. During the course of the day, there's always one or two or maybe 3 phone calls. You know, are you going to do this? What do you think about that? Have you done this?
Right.
So.
Yeah, it's tough to disconnect at any point. I would think so. But you did it.
Yeah.
And you were, and so you was now Otto passed away.
He was alive at that point.
So he was the town manager?
No, he wasn't still a town manager.
What did he
was
do?
only town manager for about 3 years, maybe almost 4. And then he decided to shift gears and almost went into business himself with his mom. But he was went to work for the Hartford Board of Education at the request of some of the board members in Hartford, because he had managerial skills. And worked for them for about 3 or 4 years. Until they drove him crazy.
Yeah, I bet that's a big school system.
It was very,
a lot of
very
politics.
Intense.
Yeah. What did he do for them?
He was business manager.
Oh, just strictly a business manager?
Strictly business manager, trying to make sure that they kept all of the slips and reports and records they needed to do to file all the information necessary to get your grant funding, because if you don't file all that information, then the federal government doesn't give you your money.
Right. So that's quite a task.
It was quite a task. They used to come home in paper bags full of.
What did he do from there? Then
after that, he and his mom, who had been an executive secretary for a number of people, and Vita Root was one of them, and then she was involved in politics in Hartford. They started a business called Newman Associates. And it was administrative services for nonprofits and small businesses. So they would set up bookkeeping for you. He did bookkeeping for like Simmons, the little hardware, True Value.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. He and Walt Simmons he would keep the books. And then he kept the books for various other small businesses. And then was also had a contract with. It wasn't CRRA, but it was a Capital Region Council of Governments forerunner, and they needed a coordinator. And so he ran that for a few years. And he was also on the Board of Finance.
So he did little hardware stores, and he did large government.
He would carry stuff around, and he would sit there and add stuff in his head. You know, he had this little calculator. He could do it anywhere.
Brilliant
he could balance people's checkbooks and their books. His numbers were his thing.
So he enjoyed
that's what he did. He enjoyed it. He loved numbers. So he was doing that, and at the same time in Granby, he was serving on the Board of Finance. And then
that's no surprise, I suppose.
And just various other things that were coming along. And then he was first selectman. Before I was on the board. He was first selectman from 1967, was it? No, 69. From 1969 to 1977, he was the first selectman. While he was doing his private business stuff. So because that's a non-paying job, like many of the towns. So.
And was that the era where they hired Bill?
At the end of that era, yeah.
Okay. All
right.
Okay, so unwind my head here. Otto was doing his business.
Yep.
And you were raising a family and doing a variety of other things.
Mm-hmm.
And so take us forward from there. Otto had passed away at some point.
Well, he finished being, he lost to Bob Varenja as first selectman back in the end of '77.
Right.
And so he then turned around and decided to run for the legislature. Okay. So he was the 62nd representative.
Okay, wow.
And he did that for a number of years.
Interesting.
And I was also in a telephone business for that one. I was, taking notes, but he had, that was before they had the legislative office building and all those big, beautiful things.
Let me just ask you a quick question, because I'm a little, I was on the understanding that Granby's been consistently a one-party town. I mean, this is a political question. What party was Otto?
He was Republican.
Okay, and he was beat by a Democrat.
Yep, Bob Varenja.
Really?
Very solid. Yep.
Yeah. So the politics in East Granby Granby have gone back and forth.
Oh yeah, we have.
So you were a Republican?
I was a Republican.
And you lost on a school issue.
On a school
to
issue,
a Democrat?
And Dick O'Brien was a good Democrat. He won.
I'm sure they're all.
He did it for a couple of years, and he finally. He said, "No, I don't think this is what I'm going to do."
Fascinating little history of politics.
So it was, and before that. No, I think Bob Varenja was probably the strongest of the Dems, and then Dave Russell, who had also been one of he was first selectman when I was first on the board. Okay. So Dave Russell followed Bob Varenja. Okay.
The only reason I ask that question is because when you're winning, opposing, you're going back and forth. That's a little unusual in small towns. Usually there's which is a testament, to the politics in town. It sounds like you were putting up good candidates all the way around. So, so he ran in the legislature. Now, how long was he in the legislature?
He was in the legislature until 87.
Okay.
And then he went down to serve on the DPUC. Okay. For about 4 years. Okay. And then at that point, he wound up going in for some surgery and didn't come out of the hospital. So that was 91.
And how old was he then?
He was 55.
Well, that's unfortunate.
He had just turned 55.
Yeah. So that was a turning point in your life, I can assume. Yeah, right. That was a traumatic. So what did you do at that point?
Well, after I got through being, I went to work at the Hartford Medical Society. Okay. In about 1976 or so. Okay. And I was the librarian. Okay. You didn't have to have a library degree to be in there because it was a small private medical library that had a lot of old, wonderful historical stuff, and they were beginning to build a museum. Okay. So I went in and was helping out with running the library and helping people do research and answering questions on the phone. And then a gentleman by the name of Leonard Menzer, who was a dentist, was building the exhibits and making displays all around the building to be a medical dental museum. Okay. So I had a fascinating, about almost 30 years, from 76 up until 2009. Oh, wow. I worked in Hartford on the end of Scarborough Street. Okay. For a bunch of doctors and dentists. Interesting. Wow. So it was very interesting. So
that's a big chunk of time, and unfortunately, we're actually, believe it or not, we're running out of our hour here. But I want to ask you a quick question, because this is one of the fascinating, two quick ones. One is, if there was anything you could do for Granby, and you had a magic wand, what would that be?
I think I would probably do something about a nicer swimming pool, some recreation.
Okay, some public, like a bigger pool. Like along the lines of what they have over at the park.
We're going to be enhancing that area, but I don't know that we've got a natural pond and it's okay, but it would really be nice. We have the big swim area in the swim center that the Y has, but
that's So you have to join. And,
Yeah,
you want something public.
It would be. I think it would be really nice to have nice big.
Growing up in the city, they had that sort of stuff, or bigger towns like what I know in Enfield, we had a little neighborhood pool that they've since paved over, which was sad. Okay, one other question. Kids growing up today, I asked your husband this, and I'm going to ask you the same question. What advice would you give to young kids growing up today?
Pay attention to what's going on around you.
Okay.
Ask questions.
Okay.
And do the best that you can.
Okay.
And when you've figured out that you do have some talents, to make sure that you put them to good action and realize that you have a responsibility in the community in which you find yourself to participate.
So get involved civically.
To get involved somehow.
Using whatever.
Doesn't have to be politics, it could be other things.
Yeah.
But just be out there and be engaged.
Right.
And care.
Give back.
Yeah, give it back.
Well, that's fascinating, Diane. It's been one of these 2 interviews back to back. I'm going to need a break after you guys are chock full of history here. Anyway, so I appreciate you coming on tonight. And I would, once again, our guest tonight is Diane Newman Hernsdorf, a longtime resident of Granby. And I thank you for joining us here tonight for our second show. And we're looking forward to continuing this process and doing these interviews. And we hope you're enjoying it as much as we do. Have a good night.